Hi, Susie.
Hello. Hi, Sam.
How are you?
I'm like doing as well as a third grade teacher can do. I think as well as a newly found homeschooler who has third graders can do.
Uh-huh.
How are you doing?
I'm hanging in. I'm here. I am absolutely delighted to have this time with you tonight for a special edition of Thinking in Dark Times with Friends, which I give you complete credit for. I would not have gone down this path. So forewarning, there's probably not going to be any Hannah Arendt. There might be lots of Adorno, but we'll see what happens. So, all right. So a couple nights ago, my dear friend here, Susie, texted me and said, "Have you watched Tiger King?" And Susie, are you wearing stripes intentionally for our animal themed?
Well, in truth, actually, in keeping with the theme, I really should be wearing like a cat print of some sort. But
Yes.
I'm actually up here at my parents' place in upstate New York, and I just checked, and my mother does not own any cat prints, which is, I don't know if you want to call that like a hole in her wardrobe, or if that's or if that's something kind of working to her credit. But so this is the most exotic thing I think that I have with me.
Yeah.
So it has to go. Yeah.
So I was able to dig out my leopard print pants,
strong.
which have got me in the mood, and just for you, I
Love
found
it. Yes. So I'm actually pretty sure I have some of those at home in Brooklyn that are belong to my children, which I would not above stealing for this evening, but they are alas at home in Brooklyn and not in my parents' house upstate. So.
Yeah. Okay. So as you can probably tell, we're going to talk about Tiger King.
We are going to do it.
We're going to do it. We have binge watched the show.
Like millions of other Americans, I see,
who are stuck in their own cages right now, quarantined.
That's a great question. So what I guess this is why I got thinking about this, which is like, right, I mean, the show is absurd, it is crazy, it is all of those things, but that, like, what does it mean for us politically and culturally that this is what we're turning to, kind of like as a nation,
right.
in these conditions? And there's right, like, and I think this is the Adorno part, right, which is that underneath these like really pop culture kind of items, there's actually something that we can think about.
Right. I think we're gonna need, do you have a drink? I think we're gonna need, what's your drink?
So I am drinking a beer that is basically like strong enough alcohol content that it could be at a different beverage category, an Imperial IPA. So
wonderful.
When the alcohol content gets into like the double digit in the beer, I feel like that's where you need to be for Tiger King.
Right. Yes. I have.
Right? What do you got?
I have uncorked a bottle of red wine called La Patience. So it felt
on brand.
It felt on brand, since we don't have champagne and brie, to have a champagne and brie evening to celebrate this virtual occasion. So maybe like, okay. So you said the show is crazy, right? We're obviously all binge watching it right now. It's become a huge cultural phenomenon in this moment of quarantine. And so maybe I was, thinking, what, like we can just dig in and like we can, rip it apart and look at what's in there. There's going to be lots of animal puns, people. But so I was trying to make a list of all the things I actually love about the show.
Yes.
I love the animal print. which has been in season for like the past two,
So it really speaks to you on an aesthetic front. That's what I'm hearing.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I'm like trying to pinpoint, details that are, I can appreciate in some way. I have a personal affiliation for cults.
Oh, yeah, I remember this.
So I've joined a few in my lifetime. So that part of it really appeals to me. Like I kind of see that, there's a creation of community here. There's like, meaning and gathering, and there's this world that's been created. Obviously a lot of fetish play.
Yeah.
As you know, I just finished teaching a class on sadomasochism last night. There's a lot of leather. There is a lot of animal fetish play. We can go all kinds of paths with that. Down all kinds of paths. Carnival aesthetics also, I found rather appealing. I spent a summer of my life living in an amusement park, and used to perform as a clown on a unicycle in parades. So I also, I was looking for things that I could relate to.
Well, the closest I think I got was I did date a carny at one point in my life. That was my closest.
And now you're friends with a carny. So,
I love it. Okay, so full circle then.
All right, so what did you love? What did you love about Tiger King? Like, what got you excited while you were watching it?
So I kept thinking about this kind of question of like the viewer and the viewership and the audience from a few different angles, I would suppose. Yeah. One was just like, again, like what is it about this thing that is kind of captivating our attention? And what should that teach us about our kind of current political and cultural moment? Yes. I think that I called it just like crazy and weird and strange. These are not incredibly descriptive adjectives, but I do think that possibly one thing that we are finding appealing about it is that it is actually something that we can, we are like tuning into that seems stranger than the everyday insanity, which is quite really at a fevered pitch at this point. It is. And thinking about like how that, like I remember there's like this one point in episode 5 where like one of his like former employees is like, and then shit really hit the fan. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? Like where was the shit previously? It seemed to be like swirling around and like getting distributed evenly around the room for quite a few seasons now. Now it hit the fan. But I think there's something interesting, I guess, about that, like that notion that like the things can always go further, like they can always get weirder. Right. And for some reason we're collectively finding that I don't know if we're either attracted to it or comforted by it or repulsed by it, right? Some kind of combination. The other kind of viewership issue that I'm interested in is how it kind of performs, right? It's like a Netflix documentary, and it really performs a certain type of like white trash flyover state sort of thing for a viewership which is largely coming from the cities. I mean, not only and not only, but it definitely feels like there is some sort of like this is carefully produced for like, I feel like a very kind of like your typical like liberal like Netflix viewer in mind, and about these kind of places that it's really, it kind of ends up like almost like fetishizing that type of difference between like, oh, like crazy Oklahoma, and Sam, you and I are both like from some of those like places that often get like fetishized in this manner, and right?
Yeah, like we're Midwestern girls.
You're Midwestern girls, and I mean, Ryan, I grew up in rural South Dakota, and I was like remembering as I was watching this that actually a girl who I went to high school with, I mean, all the way school with, like, her family owned an exotic animal farm. Right. And I don't know if they did like road shows or what exactly they did with the animals, but like I remember that like that was a thing, and I kind of never thought much about it growing up. So yeah. I don't know. So I'm also just kind of interested in the kind of the viewership question and how how that particular type of like culture or aesthetic is being kind of spit out for consumption for people who, you know, maybe live in New York City, have not really been to any of these places.
Yeah, so we have, I mean, I think in a certain way, you're almost actually flipping Adorno on his head in the culture industry chapter in Dialectic of Enlightenment there, because he talks about how working class aesthetics are represented in film so that the worker can go to the cinema after a day of labor and see themselves represented on the screen. And this
Yeah.
becomes a part of the reification of social forces of domination that exist within society. But here we have an example of television that's being produced for a specific audience that is consuming this kind of media it's not actually representing like those, it's not representing us, it's not representing those people. And so there's this really voyeuristic
Super voyeuristic. It is, no, it is the, right, it is like the, it is, I mean, so much of this is just kind of like classic, like the, like projection and like othering. Yes. Right. And I mean, you could actually make this argument with a lot. I feel like I'm not a huge like TV viewer. Actually, it's like very unusual that I was like, let's talk about a show. You know, you have like there's also like a new series like Unorthodox, which is ostensibly about like the Satmar Hasidic community, and I feel like there's a similar kind of like, you know, it's not just like we're gonna like show you inside this different world, but there is this kind of question as to how that different world is being projected and really is being represented and really presented as like the polar opposite of everything you, viewer, right, like hold dear and think is valuable.
We can't subject the world that we're presented with in Tiger King to our normative value judgment. You know, so I was teaching Susan Sontag's essay, Fascinating Fascism, last night, which is, you know, ostensibly a book review of Leni Riefenstahl's Last of the Nuba. But she begins with, you know, dismantling her reputation as a filmmaker for the Nazis. And she talks about how the rallies were designed to be filmed to represent a world in order to create it.
That world, yes.
So it's not moving from organic experience. And I think, you know, it's so easy to get sucked into all of the drama and the subplots that are unfolding through the episodes, you know, that I think it's important to step back and remember this is television. It's being, you know, it's part of the reality TV docudrama genre, and it's being constructed to give us an image of a world that's being created that doesn't necessarily reflect the world that is. It's commodifying certain aspects of it through the production of the show, through all of the different, you know, characters that we're introduced to and their dialogues and how they're interacting with one another and the close-ups.
I mean, there's so many layers of, you know, just, you know, it's just worth noting, right, that there's just so many layers of representation here, right? Because like even within the documentary, you see the producer who's filming the reality show about Joe in the background of Joe actually putting on like his like internet animal show, which is like supposed to be like somewhat serious or like not, you know, specifically reality TV, but is, you know, kind of that is produced and edited. And so it's like we're already like 3 or 4 steps removed from like the thing itself, right? Because he is already acting, you know, as and they mentioned this, as if the cameras are always rolling.
Always,
right?
Always.
So,
that's something about
he is a character. He really is a character in like the true kind of sense of the term.
Yes, I think very much so. And he has a story that he wants to tell. He has his own image. He has this, you know, so I think is it episode 5 when we get the overview of him running for president and then governor?
That's on my list too.
So let's talk about that. What happens there?
I mean, what I found was amazing was that he got like 20% of the vote.
Yeah.
In like the governor race, like 20% of people were just like, well, actually, why not this guy? And and so we can read that, I feel like, a bunch of different ways. We can read that as kind of like an indictment of like a kind of like a status quo, two-party system, politics as usual, where people feel like they don't really have alternatives and they don't have choices, and that this is, you know, this is something different, so to speak. And I mean, the more charitable view of this would be, okay, well, why not? Like, is, you know, that there is it like this kind of brings into kind of question this whole issue of like celebrity and office, which, right, we've had quite a lot of discussion on at the kind of presidential level, as of late. But, you know, what exactly has happened to kind of, you know, public office that kind of celebrity seems to be merging with it, right, in this interesting way, right? And it's, I don't know, I have, in like, I have a bunch of different kind of thoughts on this. They're kind of mixed. Like on the one hand, really thinking about the kind of Platonic notion that we should take turns ruling and being ruled. You know, that office is not meant to be something that is like a professional gig, right? That you're supposed to have professional politicians in theory, right? You have you're supposed to be taking turns and rotating through the citizenry, and that we've seen the professionalization of politics, right, in a very real way. And then you have these people like Joe Exotic, who are kind of in their own very interesting way pushing back against that as these kind of like, you know, total outliers. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think in a lot of senses, there's not much difference between Joe Exotic and Donald Trump. I'm reminded immediately of the ticket-taking mentality chapter in The Authoritarian Personality, where Adorno talks about how, Susie, where'd you go?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Is your phone growling?
My phone was like vibrating and I was trying to turn it off, but it's fine. Yeah, if you hear the buzzing, it's just, you know.
It's your tiger. Like, I see all sex toys. Okay. All right. So, you know, like Adorno talks about how our consumption of news media and information has totally merged with entertainment. So we don't actually draw a distinction anymore between politics and entertainment. They have, you know, merged into one in our political conversations. You know, I'm wondering what kind of character Joe Exotic is, because he's not really an anti-hero. I mean, he might be closer to, you know, what Walter Benjamin in his essay on violence describes as like the great mobster, like the villain that people identify with, who assumes this kind of anti-statist, I'm outside the law, I can do what I want. You know, this is, you know, what America means is that I'm free. And that means I can be however I want in the world, and I can make the world in my image, and I can act as God in my own little universe. And so, that's very close to Donald Trump's standing on Fifth Avenue and saying, I can
shoot anyone I want.
I can kill 200,000 Americans with a pandemic because I don't take responsibility for my actions. And oh wait.
Yeah. I mean, there's, right, so I feel like there's a bunch of different potential archetypes you could point to. The one that, more than like the mobster villain, the thing that is more apparent to me is that he's like the cowboy. Like, this is the Wild West, this is the frontier. And that is really familiar to me as like a kind of not so much as culture, but truly as nostalgia from growing up in a place like South Dakota, where and it still very much kind of informs everything from kind of attitudes toward federal government to gun ownership and you know, even state government. And that seems to me to be like what he is channeling, that he is like this is his own like frontier, you know, like he is, right, all of this language of like of monarchy, right? He is the king, his kingdom. Like this is literally a realm that he's exerting sovereignty in, right? Like,
which was the prosecutors, I believe, opening, was it the opening or closing statements in the final episode, where she's like, you know, the problem with somebody who thinks they're a king is they think
the final episode,
yeah.
And I mean, and of course, right, these things are already like, you know, shot full of contradictions. So you have this kind of like libertarian thread, but right, of course, like Joe Exotic's not on the frontier. He's like in the middle of Oklahoma, and he like drives down roads that somebody paid for in order to get to his animal park, right? Like it's there's I mean,
But
there is a kind of the like the libertarian, you know, fantasy of kind of
yeah.
being outside the law or outside the system is so hollow at the end of the day, because like everything that they do assumes the existence of that system. Uh,
Yeah, so there, I mean, there's those lines about like team government versus team Joe, and I'm a libertarian, so fuck the Fed. Um,
yes, like
but
his campaign.
I'm still gonna, do what the Fed wants.
Yes, exactly.
Can we linger for a minute on the juxtaposition of images between like cowboy, those like concrete paved roads we all drive down that are paid with our tax dollars, if we have American infrastructure still, and nature, and
Yes.
like the trying to cordon off our own space in the world in nature. What is that? What is that desire? What is that assuaging for us right now? What is that speaking to? What is the image of that?
I mean, they're right. There's so many layers to this. The first is that, of course, the nature itself is not natural, and at least in the way that most people use that term, right? That is like a highly manufactured setting. So, right, you have at the most basic level, you have species that do not live on this continent, right? This is nature,
They
and
don't
we are,
belong here.
and you interact with them in this kind of park that is literally built, right, with heavy machinery and fencing and all of this stuff. And so we already have this like super mediated and kind of, I wouldn't say artificial, but really mediated relationship with what is viewed as kind of like the natural world here. And that I think that is like the first piece that's really important, to keep in mind.
Yeah, so can I read you actually a passage from Adorno?
I would, I as I sip my IPA, I would love nothing more. Sounds like a great way to spend the evening.
So I'm gonna read Susie Adorno. I'm gonna read you Minima Moralia.
Oh, so cheerful.
I read in Minima Moralia, I think almost every day. So this is fragment 74, and it's titled Mammoth. And I won't read all of it, but
Uh-huh.
just a couple, like about 7 sentences. Although it's so good, I want to read the whole thing. So he says, the desire for the presence of the most ancient is a hope that animal creation might survive the wrong that man has done it, if not man himself, and give rise to a better species, one that finally makes a success of life. Zoological gardens stem from the same hope. They are laid out on the pattern of Noah's Ark, for since their inception, the bourgeois class has been waiting for the flood. The use of zoos for entertainment and instruction seems a thin pretext. They are allegories of the specimen or the pair who defy the disaster that befalls the species qua species. This is why the overly richly stocked zoos of large European cities seem like forms of decadence. More than 2 elephants, 2 giraffes, 1 hippopotamus are a bad sign. Nor can any good come of Hagenbeck's layout, which trenches instead of cages, betraying the ark by stimulating the rescue that only Ararat can promise. They deny the animal's freedom only the more completely by keeping the boundaries invisible, the sight of which would inflame the longing for open species. And then he goes on, but he's talking, about the creation of these artificial zoological spaces,
Mm-hmm.
and how obscene they are, and how and thinking about what they mirror within capitalist society. And I was trying to think about, how would Adorno read something
Hierarchy.
fighting now, and this image of privatized zoos that are really about collecting and fetishization and the construction of an artificial world that seems utopian compared to the world outside of it somehow.
So, I mean, on the utopian thing, right? This is one of the like interesting things, of course, and like it kind of like undercuts a little bit of the single dimensionality, I would say, of Joe Exotic. Is they kind of introduce already in the very first episode that like this is like a place for misfits, right?
Yes.
Like these are the people who don't fit in. So it's like, right, Joe is gay in the middle of fucking Oklahoma. Here you go.
He's a polyamorous, polygamist gay
Yes.
man who's into who has who engages in I'll just call it kink play, whatever we want to call it. Like he has an alt lifestyle.
It is a very alt lifestyle, absolutely, and it's like and that many, right, that's kind of like that keeps being the you think about like that this as this kind of right paradox, this place of like some sort of community, and that like, right, I don't know, certainly I couldn't watch this without being struck by his overwhelming sense of like loneliness as an individual, and a sense of just kind of like deep alienation. I mean, the right like that
in episode 6 toward the beginning. I mean, I just like I want to hug him. I do.
And like that he like gets like married like 2 months after like his husband commits suicide, right? And it's just like, so he can't be alone, right? But that he is alone, and that is, and you also kind of have to wonder then what the role of this type of like thinking about that type of alienation vis-a-vis this sort of like decadence and excess, and right, that this is a privatized zoo, and the kind of the fingers of capital are everywhere here, right? That's very clearly the thing that kind of motivates them, and it brings up this kind of we chatted about this a little bit before, but this like interesting interplay between, on one hand, a kind of rhetoric of affection for the animals and conservation, but actually domination and practice.
Yeah.
And how that kind of that contradiction itself is kind of something that's endemic to capital.
Yes, and it's a very present paradox that in part plays out in the drama between Carol and Joe, where on the one hand we have all this language of conservation, the need to protect animals. In a couple of episodes, there's talk about like who's going to win this whole thing, and it's PETA, right? People for the ethical. All right, you put on your Carol wear. Should I put my cat ears back on?
Yes. Go on.
I'm wondering, how this idea of what is conservation as a theoretical concept in the way that we think about preserving the natural world in the era of climate violence, and what is this absolute desire and pleasure in subduing big cats, in subduing nature, and feeling like you can, on the one hand, there's a sense of intimacy. I think obviously all these characters develop with the cats that they're interacting with. They have personal relationships with them. But on the other hand, there's this incredible violence toward them. The supposed alleged killing of the 5 tigers, the 19 counts of animal cruelty that he's convicted of. We haven't even touched on Doc Bhagavan Artal yet, which we have to. We
will get to the good doctor.
But like, in his supposed, gassing of kittens once they phase out of play. I mean, how do
There's so many things here, Sam. There's so many things.
How do we?
So, well, I'm just gonna like throw off a bunch of stuff.
I was
thinking about like, what is it about, right? Like, like remember when there's an episode where Jeff goes to Las Vegas to start like a like big
Yes.
bus that's gonna go around and like let people play with like tiger cubs in between like their like as they shuttle them back and forth to different casinos. So like part of me was like I can like this could these why not puppies? Puppies are also very sweet and cuddly, right? Um, and more readily available on this continent.
Yeah.
What is it about like these tigers, right? These like the big cats in particular that kind of has this allure.
Yeah.
Um, and that seems to be, I mean, not just seems to be, is like very explicitly tied up with sex in the way that they are used, in the way that they are spoken about,
Yeah.
right? That there is, something about the kind of like inherent danger of this of this thing, but like in its infancy, it's like, oh, it's so cute and cuddly, and in 2 years it can kill me, and now I want to have sex with you. Like what? Like
Well,
what is this?
yeah, but just to I want you to keep going, but so in that episode when they go to Vegas, is that episode 4, I think? I can't, it felt 4 or 5.
It like the days, it has all blurred together.
It must have. But like they talk about the renting of private rooms upstairs so that
Yeah,
people can have playtime with
with
the
the
cat.
cats.
Now, when I hear that, I mean, I don't think I don't presume that we're talking about bestiality as a sexual fetish, but I hear this as a kind of play party in
Mm-hmm.
in BDSM terms that's being thrown with these animals as props, right? That somehow are exciting. There's an element of illicitness there, of transgression that is
Danger.
arousing, and it's appealing to a certain kind of desire that people find pleasurable. No, so what is that desire there? But it is explicitly sexual. I think we can
Yes.
agree. I mean, we're
Yeah.
talking about sex with cat audience members.
The other, I guess, thing that you mentioned previously, which I wanted to like jump in on, and the kind of this like question of like what like the what is conservation in this kind of era where we're like literally destroying our natural environment and have been for for many years, is that what this brings, I think, into very sharp focus is the kind of like right, like what are these people doing? They're all basically trying to make the argument that they, through their kind of exposing people to to cats, are going to kind of create a love for them and thus kind of somehow push conservation efforts. These are all individual, disconnected, right, actions, and it's like a kind of like classic like neoliberal like refraction where everything is focused on the kind of like the individual ethical behavior, and it becomes like a moralistic play at the individual level, but completely divorced from any sort of question of like systems or structures. Okay, so you want to encourage your the people who come through your park to be conservationists. How are you going to do that?
Right.
What are the political forms? What are the organizations that are going to actually like help that happen? But that there is this kind of again like this focus on this like the individual. Even so, I'm not saying that I'm like buying their argument that they are great conservationists, but even like the way that this argument functions on a rhetorical level seems to be very much wrapped up in that kind of question of like the kind of the moralization of politics, essentially, as
Yeah.
it becomes an individualized pursuit rather than something that can be achieved through collective action.
Yes, and it's I and all so for all of these characters, for Carol, for Doc, for Joe, who are running these cat parks, we get these narratives about what propelled them into the business, and
Uh-huh.
they have different stories, but all of them are personal, and they're all about the pleasure they found when they interacted with big cats for the first time. So, these were not individuals who are coming to this kind of, I'm thinking of Carol specifically, she's not coming to this work really because she cares about conservation. Like, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna say it. Like, this is a kind of foil. You know, her work, whatever it is, exists because Joe's work exists. And it's not about the preservation of species. It's not about caring for the planet. And it's not about, you know, there's something incredibly individualistic about her intent and her will and her own, you know, moral motivations for doing the work that she's doing. You know, there's been a lot of debate about whether or not she's been rightly cast as the villain.
Yeah. I mean, it's really funny because our like a friend of mine just watched like one episode and was said to me like earlier, she's like, I kind of don't get it because like they're trying to set up this like big divide, but isn't she kind of just like doing the same thing that they are? Like, I don't understand. Like, so I mean, I do think that like part of the you know, the appeal of the series is that like that line between like, yeah, what's a refuge, what's the sanctuary, and what's the like private zoo, and like the you know, and how these things kind of get branded, and basically like who plays the rhetoric game better, that these things become like really meaningful. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what else to say, but I've got my Carol Baskin shirt on. Carol, if you're with us tonight, this awful paisley is for you. I thought you'd like it.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's really, you know, they're both, if we just take Joe and Carol, they're both expressions of bourgeois individualism, which are fostered by a capitalist economy. You know, I'm reminded of, I love showing my students the, I can't remember, it's like 10 years ago, Super Bowl commercials for, you know, that for Cadillac and then Ford. And Cadillac, it's this incredible commercial where this guy is like, you know, wearing his khaki and his polo shirt, and he's walking through his big mansion house, and he's like, why do Americans work hard? You know, and then he's like showing off his beautiful wife and, you know, the beautiful house. It's basically David Byrne song, and, you know, like the pool and the car and the kids. And he's like, you know, we went up to the moon. You know, what happened? We got bored, you know, but we left, you know, a car there. Why? Because we're the only ones going back. And then he says, you know, like, those other countries take August off. You know, the upside of only taking 2 weeks off is having, you know, all this stuff or whatever, Nespa. And then Ford released a counter, you know, so it's like this really prototypical bourgeois image of American life and what it means to be, you know,
American.
Yes. And so Ford then released this counter commercial with an African American woman who's wearing a Carhartt, and who's like, you know, why do Americans work so hard? And it's like shot for shot. And it's like, so we can collect, you know, like, why do I spend my weekends going to restaurants collecting, you know, scraps of food, or collecting, going to farms and collecting animal shit, you know, to grow organic gardens for community spaces.
Yeah.
And this is the upside of giving a damn Nespa. And it's the same thing.
It's like it's two different kind of sides of the same coin.
Yeah. So let's talk about Doc.
Oh my God, Doc is like,
throw him in.
okay, can we all just like recall like our introduction to Doc, for those of you who haven't seen it, is, I don't know if Netflix is gonna love us or hate us for this, is him like basically riding into frame on a giant
elephant. Yes.
An elephant, which is a very kind of like, it has like a very like master kind of slave, and also very like phallic imagery to the whole,
and orientalist imagery. Doc Bhagavan Arthur is, you know, he was a devotee of the guru.
Yes, Sam, I've never had a guru. Maybe you want to speak about this one.
Okay, so I spent 2 years of my life with the Hare Krishnas.
I am so fucking proud that I have gotten you to admit that on camera.
I did. Like, I spent a whole year of my life living as a monk. And not eating meat. You know, he's a vegetarian, of course. Getting up at 3 o'clock.
This was after your spin on the unicycle. I just want to get the chronology right.
When I left, so yeah, I mean, there was the clown work and then the amusement park work, and then I joined that International Socialist Organization and was a Trotskyist for a while, which I also considered cult work. So then I thought this kind of monkish life would be interesting. That's not the right way to put it. But so, I mean, he literally, so if Joe thinks of himself as like the sovereign monarch and Hobbes Leviathan who rules his tiger scepter over his kingdom, Doc seems to be, you're like, the clothes are coming off.
I couldn't do Carol anymore. It wasn't working.
Okay, then I'm taking off my cat ears. Then Doc is God, right?
Yes.
I mean, he's Lord. That's his, and he's running a sex cult. I mean, I'm just gonna say it. He's running a sex cult that is incredibly it's rooted in the appropriation of a religious tradition that values submission to the divine, and he has turned himself into the divine, and he control. I mean, this is a kind of 24/7 sub-dom relationship where he is controlling every aspect of these women's lives: what they eat, when they go to work, when they go to sleep. He's who they're having sex with, which in some cultures is considered the highest form of devotion and submission, erotic longing. And this is, somehow, I don't know, I've been really wrestling with, how does he get off looking so good compared to Joe and Carol?
Well, because, he has, anyone watching this can tell that Doc is he's like a sleazebag, right? I believe that is the the technical term for this. But he's just so much smarter about it than Joe, right? Like, part of it is that he's just so much better at it. He is right, that he is the aspirational thing that Joe wants to be, but it's kind of always a half a step off of, and right. I mean, it says at the end that he's now under investigation as well, yada yada yada. But I think that that is kind of part of his guru suave, is that he fashions himself also as the much better manager, the much better businessman. He's gonna avoid getting he is a character as well, obviously, right? But he doesn't have the layered reality shows and the everything that Joe has kind of built up around that fact. And so it's they both have this kind of interesting kind of question of performance and domination, but they're acting it out in a different way. And the way that Doc does, it's just it's frankly much more digestible, I think, to kind of a bourgeois sensibility, and thus he comes off looking better. It's oh yeah, well, this guy is smarter and he's a little under the radar and not quite as explicit, right? He's a better businessman.
He's a better actor. Yeah.
I think that is key.
Yeah. Susie, did you see the news that broke 3 hours ago that Joe's been transported to quarantine in a facility in jail because of coronavirus? He's in forced self-isolation.
I did not.
I feel like we should acknowledge that. It seems especially sad. So I want to ask a question about that, but I want to ask you a question in particular. So we haven't really talked about, I mean, there's a lot to say about sex and fetish here, but like we haven't really talked about um, the guns.
Oh yeah.
You have been working on gun violence
Yeah.
and thinking a lot about this. And this, there's this aesthetic created. So if we were, trying to like take apart the elements of, there's leather, there's animal print, there's, um, exotic species, there are confined spaces, there's the Walmart food truck, which I think has a certain interesting role in this
Yeah.
film, and there's the incredible presence of guns. People sleeping with AK-47s under their mattresses, people buying explosive bullets. Where I come from, guns aren't a big deal, right? Like, so everyone I know in Michigan pretty much owns a gun. Like, when people have parties, they throw ATF parties where they go out into the middle of the woods and they drink alcohol and shoot firearms and smoke cigars. Like, no, it's true, right? I'm just like,
I'm not laughing out of judgment. I'm like chuckling because I'm like, I'm going to pretend that this is a totally foreign thing to me. I've never heard of this or taken part in any such activities myself. Oh, isn't that quaint, Michigan?
right. The Michigan militia. I mean, so like it's not. So where I come from, this is not foreign, but this is obviously something that's also, really central to a lot of the political conversations that we've been having in the United States right now, and the presence of guns and gun violence and the rhetoric around the Second Amendment. And there was that video of Joe Biden being confronted in Michigan in a factory by a worker who was telling him, like, why do you say you're taking our guns away? And Joe Biden yelled at him. Like,
yeah.
what's going on here? How do guns factor into this, and what work are they performing in the show?
Yeah. I mean, I really honestly can't think about guns, even like guns in places like, the Midwest, South Dakota, where I grew up, or, Oklahoma, where Tiger King is set, without coming back to this kind of word nostalgia, which is usually a kind of a reactionary kind of force. Right? It is, what is being reenacted is a world that no longer exists, right? And not just a world that no longer exists, but a set of like power relations that no longer exist, a degree of personal agency which actually no longer exists.
Yeah.
And that to talk about like the emotional role, like the emotional pull of guns on us, it's hard to kind of, right, we think about like militias of like Revolutionary War, for example, but in my mind, it's much more the kind of like process of westward expansion, and again, like the rhetoric of like the frontier, and bringing that which is lawless like under domination. And guns is the chief mechanism to exert control over nature, and kind of, American Indians in this narrative are part of that kind of like natural world that otherwise we simply don't have. And so, right, the guns they give in the immediate kind of context of Joe Exotic, of course, guns gives this like power and protection over the animal world. And also kind of like, right, vis-a-vis one's enemies in the human world, and this like sense of again, this sense of agency where maybe it doesn't actually exist or exist in the way that people imagine. Like my dad grew up in very, very rural, like where my dad grew up makes like where I grew up seem like really like the big city. So like, I mean, he grew up like really kind of off in a very, very isolated part of kind of northwestern South Dakota. And they took guns everywhere. And they took guns everywhere because they might have to like shoot a coyote who is like chasing after their livestock. Or like they might see like a wild turkey on the way home and bring him home for dinner. that world actually, I mean, there are places, right? There are ranchers out there who have coyote problems. I see you, I hear you, but that's not the world that people who live in suburbs and have like a
Right.
basement safe full of like um, like MP15s are kind of living within. There and but I think that there is something about this which is intimately again tied into a nostalgia for a certain type of agency that we now narrate as freedom, right?
What is
And
that? What is that freedom? What is the moral claim being made? What is the desire? What is that we
I mean,
associate with
it's right. It is the not only like the freedom, but is like the freedom of domination, the freedom of exerting power, but that the individual will not be checked by something larger than itself. Right. That is the frontier. Is the lack of kind of like any right. You're like it's like the lack of government, the lack of kind of like other systems, the lack of law and order. It is the absence of sort of all of those like systemic foes, which nowadays seem to restrict the amount of kind of personal agency that we actually, can exercise. And right, that critique is not necessarily wrong. It's just I would say that that the guns are not the most helpful way of expressing frustration with those systemic foes. But right, we do feel this. We feel this, all the time, of a kind of like a sense of like futility or a sense of frustration about what we as individuals can accomplish vis-a-vis kind of the world at large. And I think what guns enable people is this kind of like myth that they are in charge, that they are in control, when that has never been less the case.
So is there a difference, a substantive difference between the guns and the cats?
Is there a substantive difference between the guns and cats? Great question. I, I mean, I think they kind of both play on certain this kind of certain strings of dominance and control. But the cats are still like they are the thing being dominated, right? That is what the right that the guns are useful for them as well, right? You have this episode where Joe like has to like he like shoots kind of like on the side of a tiger,
Right.
um, because he's like hacking his foot or something.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think the kind of like question of like the tools of control over the natural world,
Mhm.
and what that does to our vision of human agency is very important here, and how much freedom we actually have to maneuver in the world, and that guns give us a false sense that we actually have more freedom to maneuver than is the case.
So a question I haven't that I've been thinking about, but I haven't teased out is, to what extent does this world of guns and big cats and this creation of this anti-statist, individualist, libertarian, community, to what extent is this either an affirmation of what we might call enlightenment thinking or a rejection of it? The philosophy questions come out when I'm when
I would say I'm gonna like I'm gonna need a refill. Let's have that question one more time for both the audience and my benefit.
yeah, okay,
Is
so
this
so let's take a refill moment so we can.
so the guns, the kind of like domination in general?
So I'm thinking about, right, so I'm thinking about what are the elements of enlightenment thinking
Hmm.
as a way of being toward the world,
Yep,
where the individual is under.
exerting control and kind of dominating through rationality.
Yes, yes. And so is this an affirmation? Is this a kind of Sadian logical limit of enlightenment reasoning? Is this an expression of that? Because there's something incredibly sadistic about it. And it's all about pure domination and control and the desire to exert one's will over and against the other in this kind of anti-Hegelian way. Or is it an absolute rejection of enlightenment reasoning, because it's a, a turning, it's this kind of turning inward against the world and a rejection of logical
Paradigm.
rationality in many ways as well.
I mean, I love this question. I'm not sure if I have an answer, and I'm honestly, I wonder even if, right, this is kind of these are kind of like the classic classic terms, or the classic binary that is usually, it's like the dialectical kind of pivot, of course, of dialectic of enlightenment. I wonder if this binary works for us anymore. Are these the only two options? Between a kind of an affirmation or rejection of that type of thinking? I mean, I'm not, I guess I'm not certain what, even thinking about it through those terms, what does that open up for us here? Or are there different terms that we should even be thinking about this through?
Yeah. So I think so the first thought that I have then is, this seems to be, all right, so this is an exercise in imagination, right? For
I now I have white wine which is clinically proven to expand time.
There's an expansion of the imagination. There's something that I find deeply compelling about this world that Joe Exotic has created, that wants to create space for people who don't conform to the normative values of bourgeois society.
Mm-hmm.
In the same vein, I'm very much attuned to the extent to which anti-statist attitudes have in part led to the election of Donald Trump. And I don't know if it's possible to repair these things, these two different elements. I also, there's, how is it that one establishes their agency, their willpower as an individual? So I'm thinking of Rousseau, right?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of a more prop. I'm thinking of the ways in which the guns and the animals allow for Joe to extend himself beyond himself, to exercise a kind of agency and power in a world where he's a gay man. He's a gay man who's into fringe things, who is a polygamist, who is polyamorous. And all of these things are, very much taboo for most of mainstream America. You started by talking about the voyeuristic element of this show. And after Trump was elected, I wrote an essay about the ways in which you can map American television viewing patterns to the electorate. So, the people watching Netflix and the people watching Hulu are liberal Democrats. They are.
Yeah, it's a totally different audience than people watching cable news.
Yeah, I mean, so, the Hallmark Channel and ESPN and Fox News are the top watched networks in the country, and they have, those are channels that are all about representing sports, and a very heteronormative, very traditional lifestyle. And so maybe we need new language, we need new terms. Maybe this isn't just affirmation or rejection of Enlightenment thinking. Maybe the political world has become,
well, we can certainly talk about this as, I mean, thinking about this, and I mean, and this is not wholly distinct from kind of Adorno, describing the kind of like a certain merger between entertainment and politics, right? But thinking really about the kind of question of spectacle there, right?
Yes. Yes.
That this is a spectacle in many ways, right?
Right.
This spectacle put on for a kind of like a largely, liberal audience, as what they are not, right? It is a Joe thinks of himself in these spectacular terms, right? As a character, we kind of describe the like all of just like all the different layers of kind of filming, and like all the ways in which cameras are present, and are shaping actually behaviors, within this. And we can talk about kind of politics as a spectacle as well, and that like there is the point where, right, where Joe and Donald Trump kind of come and intersect in this real way, is that it is really like, are we missing the point by looking for the point?
Yeah.
uh
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and that my I've been working on this like in an entirely different context. I'm writing this book about how jihad has evolved over the last century,
Yeah.
and
Which has a lot to do with spectacle and violence.
comparing, actually. So I have like a chapter where I'm talking about kind of kind of contemporary like jihadist terrorist attacks and like mass shootings. And in my reading, I say these are both, frankly, like forms of like anti-politics. Like if we think about politics as some sort of like mechanism for kind of collective problem solving, for the of the management of affairs of something beyond like the immediate community, um, this is not an alternative vision, right? This is not a different, this is not the idea that like a different type of world is possible. It's actually that there is no other world possible here on Earth.
Yes.
That is the importance of the kind of like apocalyptic thinking within kind of contemporary jihad, is that actually it is impossible to imagine what an alternative might be right here on planet Earth.
Yeah.
So when I'm like thinking about spectacle here, I think my thinking is very much influenced through like looking at a lot of ISIS propaganda, where it is, right, where and yeah, I mean, and a huge part of this project is like comparing it to different forms of violence that we see in the West, and putting these kind of like unlikely bedfellows in conversation with one another, and that politics, and that's kind of like spectacle as the kind of like the antithesis in some way of like what we might mean in a kind of, as politics is like a way of changing things, or maybe even, can we hope, making things like ever so slightly better. Like that is not the purpose of spectacle. And I feel like it's much more productive to situate Joe Exotic in
Yeah.
that, like in the lens and the language of spectacle, than almost anything else.
Yeah. Yeah. So the creation of spectacle, the manufacturing of spectacle, I'm reminded immediately of Machiavelli and the story he tells about Borges in The Prince, where, the body is displayed on the steps because
Yeah.
act of violence imprints a memory better. Benjamin talks about this in his essay on the storyteller as well, and death, and like the importance of violence in relationship to memory, and how that creates a set of that imprint, that act of memory making is tied to a politics, to ideas of politics, that represent ideals of politics. And there's a, I'm, the spectacle, it's a play, right? There's this staging. The camera is so important in the show, and the ways in which we see Joe and we see Carol, they're also cam actors. Like they go live on social media platforms all the time because they seek recognition, they want the attention, they brag about the millions of views they get.
I feel like we really missed the golden opportunity to open this discussion by saying, what does she always say? Like, hi, cats and kittens. Or something.
Oh, hi, cats.
Oh, no, isn't it you? All the cool cats and kittens.
All cool cats. That's what it is. It's cool cats and kittens. Hi, all you cool cats and kittens.
Right? Like,
but I'm thinking of two things in what you just said. One is spectacle and one is violence, and they're related to each other.
Yep.
One is the camera, for some thinkers like Bart, is an act of violence already. And the camera creates a sense of split subjectivity where the person who's being recorded is not acting in the moment in relationship to the experience that they're having, but is consciously aware of how the representation of their self is going to appear to an other in a future time.
Yeah.
And we see the director of the show playing with this by showing footage of Joe and Carol, where they are trying to adjust themselves for the camera. I think maybe one of the most the photograph scene, like stilled scenes that's been put out, is the one of Carol posing next to the lion, and then she wants like the perfect angle, right? She gets down on her knee.
Yeah.
So there's this inauthenticity, but it's not just inauthenticity anymore, because so many of us live our lives this way, right? It's this desire to appear, and not just appear in the physical presence of another in a kind of Hegelian sense of self-consciousness and recognition, but a desire to appear before and other in the capital sense, of wanting greater recognition in the world. And then there's the violence. I'm thinking, it's hard not to think about Heidegger here. Not going to talk about Arendt, but I'm going to bring up Heidegger. Or Freud, even Freud, like the being toward death, Thanatos, the death drive.
Yeah.
And, this embrace, so when they're in the cage, with these animals who can, they bite off their hands, they bite off their feet, they bite off their legs.
Wait,
like
Sam?
Yeah.
I mean, I can't believe that we haven't talked about this, but like, as you're mentioning kind of like the violence elements of this, I know we're like an hour plus in. We have not talked about masculinity yet at all.
Oh my God. Yeah. All right. So people aren't going to. All right. So let's like throw it on the table. All right. Okay. So
because this enacts a certain like masculine kind of relationship to violence, to power, that is like so incredibly explicit. And I mean, as I was watching the show in many points, I was like, someone really should have taught these guys when they were like little kids how to work through their feelings. I mean, that is a different read. It's like, this is like a bunch of completely like emotionally stunted predominant that simply do not have the tools to like process or work through what it is that they're experiencing about the world, and their reaction is right in this kind of it plays out through domination, through this kind of like fetishized relationship to the natural world, through violence, through guns, through like all of these kind of like these different accoutrements of dominance.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of toxic masculinity in the show. I will assert that.
All right. So we're gonna disagree. This is great. All right.
Awesome.
Like, I think maybe Doc has a kind of certain masculine dominant persona, but I want to start with Joe. because
Yeah.
the first thing that I was struck by watching the show was the intensity of the queer aesthetic, which, um, you know, I think involves a certain element of performance, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why it's a spectacle, right? There are these costumes. I mean, every time he gets dressed, he's costuming. It's very camp in a certain way.
It
This is not a performance of heteromasculinity at all. This is a very gay aesthetic. Um, you know, I it's been a long time since I was in a drag show, so I'll just like
somewhere in between the circus and the Hare Krishna, there was a drag show. Just in case you're keeping track at home with like a timeline or anything of Samantha Hill's career.
I'm 85, but there.
No, you are totally right about Joe. Right, that there is a like deeply kind of like queer aesthetic. I think the other figures in this, I'm more thinking about Jeff. I'm thinking about
Jeff,
Doc.
right? Yeah.
Like that there is this like that this world seems to and there and even with Joe, I do think that there's like like there's a lot of there's a lot that's kind of getting worked out through violence, I will say, rather than through other means.
Worked out through violence, but I'm happy you brought up Jeff. I feel like he's possibly the worst character in the entire show.
Worst character in like in what sense? Like in a moral sense, or like in like he's like not developed as a character? Like what do you mean by that? Like
good question. I'm making a personal value judgment. So yeah. I feel like, so all right, so maybe this might be a good place to wrap up the conversation, although certainly we can keep having it, and maybe there'll be a part 2 if people ask for one. But all right, so does Jeff set up Joe?
I mean, right, it definitely seems that way, and yet it like that would require like a level of kind of like cunning and like planning, which it wasn't apparent to me that Jeff was like really in possession of. So I think certainly the narrative of the documentary, if you want to talk about like the in the documentary, I think that actually Jeff really comes off as the bad guy. Even my reading of it is much more than Carol. I think that at the end it is Jeff who is the kind of like the arch villain who is conniving and kind of and I also had like the same like visceral reaction to him.
It's a masculinity. I mean, he of all the characters has a kind of masculine, I don't know what we would call it. I have a very strong reaction to him when I watch.
Swagger.
I mean, but there's, a
toxic swagger. I mean, I was just like, I cannot believe this fucker is gonna be a dad. Like, oh my god, like that. Like last
scene with the nannies. Like, if I'm gonna have a woman in my house, then it should be something nice to look at. He talks about how he has homophobic remarks about Joe being the queen instead of the king. And there's, these kind of like throwaway lines about how, I wanted to get him on camera saying certain things.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, so I could use it later. So I mean, I think he definitely comes off very poorly in the documentary, and that and per our kind of question of masculinity, like clearly he is the one who is the most like almost the most toxic. It's like I know Doc gives a lot of like competition here, but Jeff, it is pretty bad. But the way that is combined again with this like. Right, like the performance of success and of like luxury and excess and decadence as being right, like how does Joe get right? It's like almost like a seduction story about like how Joe gets, you know, caught up with this guy to begin with, where he's like, he's got this mansion and the Ferrari and all of these drugs.
And then he doesn't actually have any money.
It isn't, right? And he's like kind of like this like
con
artist.
Well, I mean, this is so, I mean, this is a kind of, it is seduction, right? It's the performance of wealth to seduce through a certain kind of aesthetic, which is afforded by money, right?
Yeah.
We end up with this really dystopian image of,
but then it's hollow, right? I mean, that's like actually like the wonderful thing about this is that if we want to read into this some sort of like implicit critique of capital, is that is all hollow. It is not there at the end of the day.
there is no there,
right?
Yeah.
Like the Ferrari is like, you're behind on your Ferrari payments. Like the shit is gonna like sink. Like but it is the, right, again, there's so much back to kind of like this question of spectacle, right? The success very much rides on the performance of this thing rather than its kind of its actuality.
Yeah. All right, so let me ask you a question to close the conversation. So
yeah,
we are in the midst of a global pandemic. We are in self-isolation. This show appeared fortuitously at the moment when we were all
quarantined.
What is it that we as Americans are taking from the Tiger King right now? What is it giving us? And why don't you give it like stars? So like 5 stars.
In terms of like how many stars I would give it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Out of is this a 4 or a 5-star system?
Well, I was thinking I like 5 stars because you get that middle star space that's not afforded by the 4-star system. But like obviously we're gonna have to do more of these about other television series. So you know, I feel like this is like we should start a rating system.
We should introduce the 6-star system. We go rogue.
Okay.
I think that the right. I mean, like the classic like read of something like this is that it's supposed to be an escape, right? That that this is supposed to be a mind-numbing, right, escape, kind of you know, per Adorno, in the culture industry, that will and that you know, the idea is that like this is going to be something that is different than whatever we are experiencing in our everyday lives, right? So we are at this like time of crisis, like shit is literally hitting the fan in a very real way. Our government has badly mismanaged this from the get-go, and the results are going to be catastrophic. That is where we are at right now. And so like, what if this is, you know, does it work through that lens? Like, is this like an escape? Does this work in that? And I'm not certain that it is. Again, I kind of am like drawn back to this paradigm that like what's attractive to this is that somehow weirder than the reality that we're living in, which is already really weird. And that like we are living through something that's completely unprecedented, and there's something comforting about watching something which is right a documentary, so ostensibly true, but that shows us like, or like, you know, like, well, you thought that your life was crazy right now, let us show you inside something that's even nuttier. So I'm not certain if that's really like the kind of like classic Frankfurt School read on this. And I'm not sure if that's like kind of like escapism thing, or if that's like kind of something else entirely, where it's almost an affirmation for us that things can be okay because like at least we're not Joe Exotic. I don't know exactly. I am still processing this. But I think that I think that we at least should kind of toy around with the idea that there is is there something like that people are finding affirmative about this, affirmative about their own life and their own choices at this time of crisis? That and rather than just being a kind of like complete break from, like, the one's own existence, or kind of a more mundane and depressing reality, like if this is something that kind of, I don't know, just that manages, that allows us to sustain that reality, because like at least we're not living in like a tiger park in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
I don't know. So I'm really just kind of spitballing ideas. It's I'm still really kind of processing what this is as
Yeah.
a kind of like cultural phenomenon at this political moment.
I feel like my gut instinct, and I don't know, I have no idea if it's right, is that this is a kind of swing back to the creation of, this kind of world making is a swing back to the creation of individual moral structure that is,
Uh-huh.
and this domination of nature and this desire is deeply somehow related to climate change and to our relationship to the natural world.
Cool. No, I think that is absolutely a kind of, in the larger frame, I think that's absolutely the case.
Yeah. But now,
and I think that's why that language of like conservation is so important, to see how like hollow it is, right? Because it's like conservation, but like absent anything that might actually help like conserve these like habitats that tigers live in the wild, right? Like there's no, again, like none of the dots are connected, which I guess is kind of like the neoliberal trademark, because we're all just little atomized individuals free floating.
Yes. All right. So we are gonna end. I want to read you one last quote from this Adorno.
Yay.
The tiger, endlessly pacing back and forth in his cage, reflects back negatively through his bewilderment something of humanity, but not the one frolicking behind the pit too wide to leap.
Beautiful. On that note, I like that we can't do any better than Adorno quoted on a fucking tiger.
Enjoy frolicking in your self-isolation cage. I can't wait to see you in person.
I know. Hugs.
There's so much to unpack in this, and impact. There's so much to unpack, and there's so much to unpack.
This was great fun. This is a great break from third grade math, which is like more difficult than I remembered. Jesus.
Yeah, no. It took me like 30 minutes today to figure out what GMT plus 2 meant. So, this is what happens when you read philosophy all day. All right, Susie, I love you, and
I love you. Thank you for agreeing to this insane suggestion.
All right, we have to do this again. Okay.